lately.
Oh, yeah.
Russia's economy.
Okay.
You guys wanted to unpack how it's weathering those sanctions because let's be real, that whole Russia is doomed narrative.
Right.
Yeah, we're not really buying that.
It's more nuanced than that, I think.
Exactly. And that's why we're here.
Yeah.
This video essay, Testo Encolado, it throws out a number that honestly stopped me in my tracks. Over 16,000 sanctions against Russia.
I know, it's wild.
You'd think they'd be like begging for economic mercy at this point.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But that's not what's happening.
Not at all. And to really get why, you got to kind of go back and look at Russia's economic history. The period after the Cold War, then dealing with sanctions back in 2014. Those were wake-up calls for them. Like, they've low-key been prepping for this moment for a while.
Interesting. So it's not just like blind luck keeping them afloat. They'd kind of anticipated this showdown.
In a way, yeah. Take their gold reserves, for example. They've been strategically hoarding gold. Like, seriously, like a dragon in a fairy tale.
Oh, wow.
Which actually plays into their strategy later on.
Okay.
And you know how much of global finance, like, relies on the US dollar?
Right, yeah.
They've been trying to, like, de-dollarize, minimizing their reliance on it for years. It's like trying to create their own financial playground where the West's rules just don't apply.
Wow. Okay, so some serious foresight there.
Sure.
But even with that prep time, to see actual economic growth under these conditions, Testo Encolado said 3.6%. That's wild. That's not just surviving. That's practically thriving. What's the secret sauce?
So that's where the concept of a war economy comes in. It's kind of a historical pattern. Nations shifting gears, prioritizing military production, certain industries. Think back to the U.S. during World War II.
Right, factories went into overdrive, all hands on deck to support the war effort. But even with that context, Russia's pulling this off while also under, like, crippling sanctions. It makes you wonder, what are they having to give up to make those numbers work?
Yeah, that's the million-ruble question. And it's not a happy answer. Testo Encolado highlights this chilling detail. By 2024, their military spending is projected to exceed their social spending. Just let that sink in for a moment.
Wow, that's a serious trade-off. We're essentially betting the future on this. But can that last? Is throwing money at the military a viable long-term strategy?
That's what we got to figure out. To answer that, we have to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of their strategies. And a big one is their use of gold.
Right.
Not just as like a shiny metal, but as a financial tool.
Okay, so we all get gold. Right. It's valuable, it's sparkly. But how does it become the backbone of an entire economy?
Right.
It can't just be about having a really shiny vault, can it?
It's definitely more complicated than that. But in essence, they're using gold to try and create this alternative financial system. See, most sanctions, like blocking them from SWIFT, freezing assets, it all kind of relies on Russia playing by the West's financial rules.
Right.
They're trying to rewrite those rules using gold.
So while everyone else is freaking out about inflation and the dollar, they're over there saying, look at our nice shiny gold, it's always valuable. Is that actually working?
Well, the early results are definitely raising eyebrows. While the West is trying to isolate them, Russia has been busy building partnerships, finding workarounds for trade.
Right.
It's like they're playing 4D chess while everyone else is stuck on checkers.
And when we talk about those partnerships, one name keeps coming up. And it's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
China.
Right.
It feels like we can't talk about Russia these days without mentioning, like, the dragon in the room.
You're absolutely right. The Russia-China relationship has become this, like, economic powerhouse. Especially in the last few years, we went from, like, $17 billion in trade to a jaw-dropping $240 billion.
Wow. In how long?
In just 3 years.
Hold on. That's not just growth. That's like winning the economic lottery.
It's huge.
What's fueling that kind of explosion?
Well, it's more than just raw materials. Sure, China's buying Russian oil, but it goes way beyond that. We're seeing this deepening cooperation on tech, finance, even joint military exercises.
Wow. So they're not just partners. They're building their own little, like, power center.
Exactly.
But, you know, Testo Encolado brought up this fascinating point about how Russia's getting around sanctions, even for, like, everyday consumer goods. They even mentioned Apple products.
Right.
Which seemed wild to me.
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. At first, Apple officially pulled out of Russia, yet you can still find iPhones and MacBooks in stores.
Yeah. How does that even work?
Right. Remember all those loopholes in global trade we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
The ones that kind of make your head spin?
More twists and turns than a pretzel factory.
Well, Russia's become a master at untangling those pretzels. They've relaxed their import laws, so goods can slip in without needing, like, the brand's okay.
Okay.
This opens the door for these third-party traders. They buy stuff in places without those strict sanctions. and then they funnel it into Russia.
It's like a game of supply chain telephone. Instead of a whispered message, it's a MacBook passed through, like a network of anonymous buyers and sellers, until, bam, it's in Moscow.
Exactly.
Sneaky, but kind of brilliant.
It really highlights how tricky it is to actually enforce sanctions in our globalized world.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just like tech gadgets. We see the same thing with luxury cars, designer clothes, you name it. If someone in Russia wants it and has enough rubles, someone will find a way to get it to them.
Wow. Okay, so far we've got this picture of Russia's economy being like surprisingly resilient, maybe even thriving in some areas.
Yeah.
But what about the everyday Russian citizen? How are they experiencing all of this?
That's the core question, right? Because GDP growth and these fancy trade deals, they don't tell the whole story.
Right.
A lot hinges on the ruble's stability,
Okay.
which has been, well, anything but stable lately.
That feels like the understatement of the year.
Yeah.
The source described it as like a roller coaster, which almost feels too mild. It plummeted after the invasion,
Yeah.
then briefly hit this like all-time high, and now it's all over the place.
Yeah, and that right there shows you the power and the limitations of a central bank trying to control things.
Okay.
They flooded the market with rubles to artificially like prop up its value. Problem is, that strategy is not really sustainable.
It's like they're trying to hold back a tidal wave with like a bucket.
A good analogy.
Oh, yeah. The source also mentioned that the ruble dipped when Ukraine went on the offensive. Correlation doesn't equal causation, but you can't help but notice the timing.
It's interesting. It goes to show how intertwined all of this is. Military actions, political decisions, like global market moods, all these factors play a role in the ruble's value and ultimately in the daily lives of Russians.
Right. So for the average person trying to buy groceries, pay rent, just like live their lives,
Yeah.
what's the reality?
Well, inflation is the big worry. It's been steadily rising, and it's higher in Russia than in many other countries right now. So clearly, these measures they've taken are having some, unpleasant side effects.
So even if those iPhones are on the shelves, they're a whole lot more expensive if you're earning rubles, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's something we can easily miss when we just focus on the big picture. Those like macroeconomic figures, they only tell one side of the story. The true measure of an economy is how it impacts people's lives.
Right.
How far their money goes, whether they can afford the basics.
Yeah, that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating and concerning. We've got geopolitics, economics, and human lives all kind of colliding, but it feels like we're only scratching the surface.
We are, and that's what makes this situation so captivating, even a little unnerving. One phrase from Testo and Collado really stuck with me. They said Russia is mortgaging their future on this war.
It makes you wonder, like, how long can they keep this up? Is it sustainable, or are we looking at, like, a house of cards ready to collapse?
It's impossible to say for sure. What we can do is look at the potential long-term risks. And more importantly, what lessons we can learn from this unprecedented, economic tightrope walk.
So let's talk about those long-term risks.
Yeah.
Like, what are the potential cracks in Russia's, like, economic armor?
Okay.
Testo and Collado kept coming back to this idea of Russia's dependence on oil and gas.
Right.
It's like their golden goose and their Achilles heel all rolled into one.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Right now, it's definitely working in their favor, right? Energy is in high demand globally, and they've been leveraging that to their advantage, even with the sanctions and the price caps. However,
The world is slowly,
Yeah.
some might say too slowly, but shifting away from fossil fuels. What happens when their main source of income starts drying up? When the, like, oil and gas well starts to run dry?
that's the billion ruble question, isn't it? This whole war economy model, this defiance of expectations. It hinges on them being able to sell those energy resources and at a high price.
Right.
If demand drops or if green energy just suddenly takes off, Russia's in trouble.
It's like they're betting everything on black, but the roulette wheel of global energy is spinning faster and faster. Beyond the energy question, though, there's this sense of, well, fragility, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
It feels like they're holding things together with, like, duct tape and sheer willpower.
There are definitely some red flags for sure. Inflation is eating away at the average Russian's purchasing power.
Yeah.
The ruble is volatile, prone to those external shocks despite their efforts to kind of control it. And let's not forget, like, war is expensive. Even if you're, quote unquote, winning in the short term, those costs, they add up.
You can only drain your reserves for so long before you hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
What happens then? Does that carefully constructed economic facade start to crumble? Do people start questioning the narratives?
Those are the big questions. And unfortunately, we don't have crystal balls.
Right.
What we do have is this fascinating case study that's playing out in real time.
Yeah.
It challenges those assumptions about sanctions, global trade, even the very nature of power dynamics in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's like we're watching this high-stakes experiment unfold before our very eyes. It makes you think, what can we learn from all of this, regardless of how it ends?
And that's what I hope you take away from this deep dive, Russia's economic resilience. It's a stark reminder that the world is complex, interconnected, and constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
The old rules don't always apply. And sometimes the most important thing is knowing which questions to ask.
We started this deep dive wanting to go beyond those, like, Russia's doomed headlines. We wanted to understand how they were weathering the storm.
Right.
I think we got that, but with a whole lot more nuance.
We've seen their strategies, their calculated risks, and the very real challenges that they're facing. It's a reminder that understanding the global economy means understanding its impact on everyday people.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought from Tesla Incolado. Can this model of economic resilience last? Or is it ultimately unsustainable, a house of cards waiting for the right gust of wind?
It's a good question.
Only time will tell.